So we'll wait a few minutes to start. Thank you for coming. Okay, so we'll get started. Good afternoon. I'm Belinda Robnett, she, her, hers, the UC Santa Barbara Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Welcome to the Anti-Blackness Difficult Dialogue series. Before we begin, I'd like us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this place and all land upon which the University of California, Santa Barbara is located, and pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and the culture of this area. The idea for the series emerged last spring out of the Black Lives Matters protest marches that seek to draw attention to the persistence and pervasiveness of anti-Blackness and racial inequality in a society that supports institutional and systemic barriers to racial justice. So the purpose of this series is not only to feature the excellence of African American scholars throughout the U.S., but also to provide knowledge and to assist with the difficult dialogues around racial justice. This is the last event in our year-long series, and we are very pleased to have Samuel Sinyangwe come here to present for the last session of the series. We invite you to join us next year for the continuation of this difficult dialogue series, and the series announcement will be forthcoming in the fall. The UC Santa Barbara Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion is pleased to co-host this series with the University of California, Irvine's School of Social Sciences, Office of Inclusive Excellence, Henry Samueli School of Engineering, Donald Bren School of Information and Computing Sciences, and the School of Humanities. This event would not be possible without the support and efforts of the UCI School of Engineering Assistant Dean for Access and Inclusion, Sharnia Artis. So many, many thanks to you. Additionally, I want to recognize UCI's School of Social Sciences Administrative Assistant Francis Hom and the UC Santa Barbara Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office's Project Coordinator Brett Collins for all of their time in advertising this event and making sure that all runs smoothly. Last but certainly not least, I want to offer a special thank you to Chancellor Yang for his commitment to and support for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and all that it represents. Without his vision for this office, the series would not be possible. And so with that, I introduce Assistant Dean Artis, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor Robnett. So my name is Sharnia Artis, and I'm looking forward to our speaker for the day. Samuel Sinyangwe is a policy analyst and data scientist who grew up in Orlando, Florida, and graduated from Stanford University in 2012, where he studied how race and racism impact the U.S. political system. He is the co-founder of Mapping Police Violence to support activists across the country to collect and use data to fight police violence. And he's also the co-founder of Campaign Zero. And Campaign Zero advocates for local, state, and federal policy solutions to end police violence. Samuel has been featured in MSNBC, CNN, BBC, LA Times, the Forbes 30 Under 30, and the Route 100. Previously, Samuel worked at Policy Link to support a national network of 61 promised neighborhoods, communities to build cradle-to-career systems of support for low-income families. I am delighted to turn this over to Samuel Sinyangwe. So if we could give some reactions for Samuel.
Thank you. So it's an honor to be here and to be presenting today. So today I want to talk a little bit about police violence, about racism and white supremacy, and also about my journey in the context of how we can begin to use data to collect, to analyze, to visualize as a tool of storytelling, as a tool of advocacy, and as a tool of producing policy and systemic changes at the local, state, and federal levels. So I'm going to share my screen so we can go through a few slides. Cool. So my story begins on August 9th, 2014. That's when Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri, by the police. And his death sparked a nationwide movement, a movement for Black lives, a movement focused on justice, accountability, and a focus on police violence in particular, and the relationship between police for generations that have, Black communities have been saying for generations, have experienced systemic violence at the hands of police, but for too long had been ignored. And what we saw in 2014 and 2015 was the beginning of a national conversation around racism, around white supremacy, and around particularly the way that police and state violence plays a role in enforcing that hierarchy. Now, in those early days and weeks and months of the movement of this national conversation, there were some huge gaps in the story. And those gaps had a lot to do with data. So we heard article after article, news story after news story that was focused on the fact that we didn't know how many people were being killed by the police each year. The federal government, even to this day, does not collect comprehensive data on people killed by the police. They could tell you how much rainfall there was in rural Missouri going back 200 years. They could not tell you how many people were killed by the police this year or last year or the year before. Now, part of that was a methodological challenge. In the United States, there are 18,000 different law enforcement agencies of various sizes, each with their own police chiefs and leadership, their own policies, practices, culture, and outcomes. And so collecting data from each and every one of those agencies every single year in a reliable way is challenging. But it's not an impossible challenge. So we've seen the federal government collect data on a host of crime metrics. We've seen them collect data on arrests from every law enforcement agency virtually in the country. We've seen them collect data, again, on rainfall and a host of other topics. So clearly there was a way to collect this data. The federal government was either unwilling or unable to make it happen. And so we needed to find a way to gather the data that was not being captured. And so at that time, I connected with organizers on the ground in Ferguson, and we thought through what were some ways to actually collect this data. And it was actually interesting, an article that was published in 538 near the end of 2014 that, number one, looked at the federal data and said, that data is woefully inadequate. They're collecting data on, at best, 1 in every 3 people killed by police in the United States. But there were these other crowdsourced databases that existed. One was fatalencounters.org, one was killbypolice.net, and then another was a report that had been published by the Malcolm X Grassroots Project based in New York. All of these different entities have figured out a way to collect data on people killed by the police through local media reports, through public records requests to police agencies, and through looking at obituary records, social media profiles, and a host of other databases. Aggregating that information together found online, and simply creating these spreadsheets that existed online that were a row with a link to a news article, a name of the person that was killed, and a date. So these spreadsheets sort of existed online. This article, what was so powerful about it is it audited these databases and found them to be 100% accurate. Moreover, they had twice as many records as the federal database had. So the data was sort of out there in plain sight. It had not been brought together. Nobody had merged those databases. There were huge gaps around race. So about 40% of the people in the database were not identified by race. Nobody had coded for the circumstances of each incident, whether the person was allegedly armed or unarmed. What were some of the other dynamics? Why were the police called in the first place? So that was sort of the data work that I did, building out this database that had not been built before to track people who had been killed by the police across the country. And launched this database in April of 2015. And this is mapping police violence. So we launched with this map. This is a map of everybody that we had identified as being killed by the police in the previous year in 2014. What we have found since then, we've updated and maintained this database ever since. We now have data going all the way back to 2013 through the present. And what we found is that there are about 1,100 people killed by police every single year in this country. And so the purpose of this map, and one of the reasons we launched with this map and this project, was at this time, the national narrative was very focused on a dynamic whereby Black communities were saying that that police violence was systemic, that this was something that had been happening for generations. And in the media, in policymaking circles, in positions of power and privilege, there was a lot of doubt. They would say, well, maybe these are a series of isolated incidents. Maybe this is limited to a problem in St. Louis or Baltimore. But the narrative wasn't that this was nationwide, that this was systemic, that this was a national crisis at that time. And so the data was instrumental in helping to literally visualize the scale of fatal police violence in this country. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because we know that for every person killed by police, there are an estimated 2 people who are shot by police and survive. And there are an estimated 50,000 people who are hospitalized with injuries due to police violence every single year. Nevertheless, the data helps visualize this as a nationwide issue, a nationwide crisis. So again, track this year over year. What we found, about 1,100 people have been killed by police every single year. It's a remarkably stable rate of police violence. This isn't something that just got substantially worse in 2014 when the nation began talking about it more. It's not something that had a dramatic uptick last year over the year before. It's something that has been remarkably stable year over year. Even day over day, when we plot this on a calendar, this was 2020, you can see that on average, the police kill 3 people every single day. And that there are very few days in which the police don't kill anybody. There are only 18 days in 2020 in which the police didn't kill anybody. And that's just based on the cases that we know. So again, if it is not reported in the media, if it is not in the obituaries, then it is unlikely to show up in any of these databases. And we estimate that we probably have about 95% of the total number of people killed by police in this database, but there are still gaps in rural areas, Native American reservations, and other areas where it's less likely to be reported in the media. So we have this data, collected this data that the federal government refused or was unwilling to collect. A nationwide database of killings by police. But what does it tell us in terms of the problem? And more importantly, what can it tell us in terms of solutions? So one of the things that is very apparent in the data, and we talk about anti-Blackness, I know that the topic of this dialogue is around anti-Blackness, which is just the pervasiveness of racialized policing outcomes, racially disparate outcomes, racially biased outcomes, outcomes in which Black people are along every single metric that you look at with reference to policing. Black people are more likely to be negatively impacted than almost any other group. And in some cases, indigenous communities, for example, in killings by police, while again, there are huge issues with data quality around this, we also know that indigenous communities are killed by police at a rate about 3 times higher than white people, which is comparable to Black communities. So both Black communities and indigenous communities killed by police about 3 times higher rate than white people. Latinos are killed by police at a rate about 1.5 times higher rate than white people. And people of color are more likely to be unarmed when killed by the police than white people. So the circumstances under which these cases of police violence are happening are different for Black and brown people than they are for white people. Now, this is what that looks like mapped at the state level. So you can see with the bluish purple bars are the rate overall of killings by police per population. And this is from 2013 all the way through 2020. And so you can see that there are a set of states that have much higher rates of police violence than other states. They tend to be in sort of the Mountain West, places like New Mexico and Oklahoma, Arizona, Nevada, Montana, Colorado, have some of the highest rates of police violence per population in the entire country. But what you can also see with the red bars overlaid over those same states, those are the rates for Black people in particular. And what you can see is that in almost every state, Black people are more likely to be killed by police than the average for all people in that state. And in some places, those disparities are far more egregious than other places. So you have Utah, for example, which has one of the largest racial disparities in police violence of any state. Which you also see when you break this down at the city level. These are the 50 largest cities in the country. In 47 of the 50 largest cities, Black people were more likely to be killed by police than white people. 47 of the 50 largest cities. So when we say that anti-Blackness is systemic, that it is widespread, this is how widespread that is on a single metric of police violence. And this is not unique to fatal police violence. So Black people are more likely to be arrested by police in 92% of all police jurisdictions that report arrest data. So we're talking about over 10,000 police departments that report this data, because again, they report the arrest data, they don't report the police violence data that involves fatalities. We know that in 92% of all police jurisdictions, Black people are more likely to be arrested than white people. And in 47 of the 50 largest cities, Black people are more likely to be killed by police. There are 3 cities here, Fresno, Wichita, and Mesa, in which that is not the case. What is interesting about those cities is that they have relatively small Black populations, but they have larger Latino populations, and Latinos are more likely to be killed by police than white people in each of those cities. So overall, for all of the 50 largest cities in the country, either Black people are more likely to be killed by police, or Latinos are more likely to be killed by police, or both. But there is not a single city in which white people were more likely to be killed by police than both Latinos or Black people. So again, just illustrating how pervasive, when we talk about racism in the context of policing, we're talking about disparities at every level in almost every place. And it's more so a question of the degree of severity of the problem than it is a question of whether the problem exists. So what can we learn about the solutions to the problem? So one of the most important things here is understanding that these outcomes vary substantially depending on where you are. So this is the rate of police violence, of killings by police from 2013 to 2019 on average for each of these cities. These are the 100 largest cities in America. It's a scrollable chart on mappingpoliceviolence.org. And so the chart on your left, what you can see is that St. Louis, Oklahoma City, Phoenix, Tulsa, Orlando, Florida, where I'm from, have among the highest rates of killings by police of any city, any major city in the country. And what that means is in a place like Phoenix, in 2018, 1 in every 5 homicides committed in the entire city was committed by a police officer. So the police were responsible not only for a high rate of police violence relative to other agencies, but responsible for a large share of the overall amount of violence occurring in the city in its entirety. Now, at the other end of this chart, though, we can also learn about cities that have much lower rates of police violence. And what you find in the data is that for the 100 largest cities, there is only 1 city in which the city's police department has not killed anyone from 2013 through 2020. That is Irvine, California. So interestingly enough, you all are in a location that is extremely rare in the sense that it is one of the only places in which in our database, the police have not killed anybody, the Irvine Police Department has not killed anybody during that time period. In the 99 remaining jurisdictions, that was not the case. But even among some of those jurisdictions, you had places like Detroit, like Newark, that had substantially lower rates of killings by police than the national average. Even places like Oakland that had substantially lower rates than the national average. So the question becomes, what is happening in the jurisdictions that have much lower rates that is not happening in the jurisdictions that have higher rates of police violence? And more importantly, what can we learn about the places that have made the largest reductions in police violence over time, so we can unpack those elements and scale them across the country to achieve similar reductions across the country? So that's sort of the work, the research agenda behind sort of the advocacy work, the policy work, et cetera. So in terms of what we can learn, one of the most important clues here is tracking the places that have reduced police violence over time. Again, our scope is relatively narrow here. We only have data from 2013 through 2020, or actually now we have through 2021. So it's relatively limited the time frame that we have, but even in that time frame, you can see some shifts. One of those shifts that we see is with regard to geography. In particular, we see in large cities and in urban areas, there has been a reduction in killings by police of about 30% since 2013. And what we see is that that reduction has been offset by an increase in rural and suburban areas during that same time period. Now, what is interesting when we dive deeper into what's going on in urban areas, in big cities, that's explaining some of these reductions, is that we see that the places that have made some of the largest reductions in police shootings, and this is actually data we're able to get through public records requests on all police shootings, both fatal and non-fatal. And you can see between 2013 and 2019, some places have made substantial reductions in police shootings. You look at, San Francisco, Dallas, Philadelphia, we're talking 80% plus. And many of those jurisdictions have also made the largest reductions in arrests, particularly arrests for low-level offenses. So these are jurisdictions that have decriminalized marijuana or legalized marijuana. They have adopted a approach that deprioritizes or decriminalizes other low-level issues like loitering or trespassing, having an open container of alcohol, being disorderly or drunk in public, issues that are often associated with homelessness, where people will call the police on homeless people. And the police have, in some of these jurisdictions, have begun to either not respond to those calls, or the city has created an alternative response. We have civilian responders to some of these issues. One of the other things that is interesting about the data when we see that reduction over time is that we see that some of the narratives that had sought for so long to explain why we might see a reduction in police violence, or why we see police violence happening in the first place, simply did not hold water when we look at the actual data. So one of the things in this work, and you may experience this in your field of study as well, is that there are a set of sort of well-established, sort of conventional wisdom assumptions. And these assumptions have been around for quite some time. In some spaces, those assumptions are grounded in research and data and a rich evidence basis of scholarship that goes back decades, even centuries. In other disciplines, like in policing, there are assumptions that are largely based off of stereotypes, based off of a culture within policing, and a theory of policing that is largely about public order and control of populations, particularly people of color. And so what we see when we actually interrogate some of those narratives is that they don't hold water. So one of those narratives that is probably the most pernicious is this narrative about crime. So you hear this all the time. This is this narrative that the police are using deadly force at higher rates, particularly in Black communities, because they are encountering dangerous areas and dangerous neighborhoods and having to defend themselves against violent crime and violent criminals. And they have to use deadly force to defend themselves or other people from harm. This idea that the police are just in so dangerous environments and having to make split-second decisions to save their lives or other people's lives, they just had to use deadly force in every single one of these incidents. That's like the police narrative. Now, they probably will put up crime statistics and talk about quote unquote Black on Black crime. And there are all of these narratives that function to try to excuse the behavior of the police and attribute higher rates of police violence in Black communities to something other than the behavior and the fault of the police. Now, when we actually look at the data though, we see a very different story than what the police would have you believe. So this is a chart showing the rate of killings by police in the red squares and the violent crime rates in the blue X's. So you can see community violence, you can see police violence juxtaposed. What you see here is that it's not a very strong connection. That in fact, you have many communities that have higher rates of violent crime, that have relatively lower rates of killings by police, places like Detroit. You also have places that have relatively lower rates of violent crime that have relatively higher rates of police violence. So something is determining how the police respond to issues in communities, whereby they respond differently in some places than in other places. And they seem to be making choices in some places that are resulting in people losing their lives. So here's another way to visualize that. These are the 10 cities of the 100 largest cities in the country. These are the 10 cities with the highest rates of violent crime. The chart is displaying their rate of killings by police per population. So again, you can see among even cities that have similarly high violent crime rates, you have dramatic differences in rates of police violence. So what is happening in Oakland in terms of how that city is responding to some of the same issues that police in Kansas City and St. Louis are responding to at a level of police violence that is substantially lower. So that's the crime narrative, and having the data is really important, has been important to being able to push back against some of those narratives and get us to a solutions conversation. And this is how we can begin to open up some of those conversations. Because when we actually look at the data around why the police are in these situations in the first place, it is a very different picture than what the police narrative would suggest. And what we see in particular when we code, and we've coded this for cases going all the way back to 2017 through 2020, when we code for the reported reason why the police were called to the scene in the first place, what we find is that in the majority of cases in this country where the police kill people, those cases began with either a traffic stop, a mental health call, a domestic disturbance, or a series of a range of reported low-level nonviolent offenses. And so that's what the police are ending up killing people over these types of situations. And so when we can disentangle the types of situations, we can better think about what the effective response should be. And so when we look at traffic stops, for example, about 100 to 120 people are killed by police in traffic stops every single year. And when we look at cities are stepping up now in some places because of activist pressure and beginning to think differently about what the response to traffic enforcement should be. So in Berkeley, for example, you have the city council has enacted legislation that prevents the police from being able to pull people over for low-level equipment violations, things like having a broken taillight, having an air freshener hanging from your rear view mirror, having tinted windows. These are often the things where we see the largest racial disparities in traffic stops and where the police are most likely to search and even use force against people. Similarly, we see in other jurisdictions addressing the mental health calls, which are responsible for about 100 people being killed by police each year, where places like Denver have piloted a program called the STAR program, where they've responded to 100% of the mental health calls that program was called into, 748 calls in total, with 0 arrests and 0 use of force. So again, we're seeing for each of these categories of situations, there are approaches that completely remove police from the situation and have an alternative response that is already proving to be more effective. In LA County, we see the mental health evaluation teams that have actually been scaling up for years now, which is a co-responder team where you have a mental health provider who's a civilian that responds to mental health calls with the police sort of playing backup. The interesting part about this program, while the police are still technically on the scene, the police actually issue evaluations of the program. And what they say in their evaluation, in their 2018 evaluation report, the LA Sheriff's Department reported that their own sheriff's deputies would have killed at least 9 people if not for the mental health provider being on the scene to de-escalate the situation, and would have used force in 751 additional incidents if not for the mental health provider being on the scene. So again, we see the evidence of effectiveness of some of these alternative approaches already happening in cities and counties across the country. Most notably, in places like Baltimore, where the state's attorney Mosby has announced that they will not prosecute low-level offenses at all in general. So we're talking about a huge proportion of overall cases in which the police end up killing people. So that's sort of one way in which we can unpack the data, we can look at the problem, we can dissect the different contributing factors to why the police were on the scene in the first place, and then begin to think around policy solutions that are targeted towards each of those segments of the problem. One of the things that is clear, however, is that many of these approaches do take time to enact. They've taken years of organizing and advocacy to get adopted, even as pilot programs in cities across the country. And we've seen police unions and conservative politicians try their best, even at the state level, to basically overrule or block those programs from being implemented. Which means, in the meantime, there are these police agencies that continue to exist, continue to be funded, and continue to engage in discriminatory police practices. And we also know a lot about, and we can use the data to better understand, how to better hold the police accountable when they commit those forms of misconduct. So to think about police accountability, this chart can be helpful. This is Columbus Police Department. Now, they just killed Ma'Khia Bryant, and so they've been in national news recently over police violence, but that isn't the first case. There have been a number of cases, high-profile cases of police violence in Columbus going back many years. And largely in response to that, advocates and journalists locally had been able to obtain a number of records of use of force and misconduct complaints against those officers. And so one of those data sets I was able to get access to. This is a data set of all use of force incidents for a 20-year period from 2001 all the way through 2020 in Columbus by officer name. So this is really hard to get access to. It's rare to see data by officer name. In California, this would be illegal because the state has a law that prohibits officer personnel files from being released to the public. That is not unique to California. There are a number of states that prohibit governments from releasing information on the police officers that they employ that identifies those officers by name. That is not the case in Ohio, where Columbus is, however. And so this is what that data looks like. In Columbus, you have a host of officers who have used force that we actually don't know who they are or what they've done because the records have been systematically purged. And so the first thing that we learn when we actually look into we sort of unpack and examine the data on accountability is that a lot of the records are being systemically purged. And we can see how that happens when we look at police union contracts. So this sounds sort of obscure. It sounds like a really niche issue when we talk about police unions and police union contracts, but it actually matters a lot. Essentially the entire accountability structure that a city's police department will adopt depends on the negotiation between the city and the police union. And they have to agree every 4 years or so to a contract that specifies what are the rules when an officer is alleged to have committed misconduct? How can they be investigated for it? What are the rules about interrogating or interviewing those officers? Who can do the interrogations? Can you have community oversight structures involved in that process? What are the disciplinary options for officers? Once they get disciplined, can they get their jobs back and how? What happens to their disciplinary records after they've been disciplined? Do they get purged? If so, what's the schedule for purging it? All of that is negotiated behind closed doors in the context of police union contract negotiations. And so one of the things that you see when you get access to data like this is how pernicious those agreements can be. Because you see in 3,413 records, they've purged the records of which officers used force. However, we still get access to a range of information on the remaining officers. And what we see here is that there are a portion of officers, about 6% of the entire police force in Columbus, that is responsible for 50% of all of the use of force reports. And that's not unique to Columbus. There have been similar investigations in Chicago, in New York, in a host of cities across the country that have found similar findings, that it tends to be a set of officers that is responsible for a huge disproportionate amount of use of force, of civilian complaints and allegations of misconduct. Now, what is also interesting about this, and again, this chart is showing the sort of left side of that chart. There are hundreds and hundreds of officers in the police force. And so most officers have 1 use of force incident, 0 use of force incidents, 2 use of force incidents. These officers have 100 use of force incidents or more in some cases. And what you can see is that the bars colored red are the cases in which they receive no discipline at all for those incidents. And what we see here is that in 99% of all use of force incidents, no officers are disciplined. And that for some of these officers that have the worst records, that have used force up to 100 or more times, many of those officers have never been disciplined for any of those incidents. And in the cases where an officer is disciplined, it is almost always a reprimand or counseling. So basically a slap on the wrist. None of the officers had been terminated during that time period. And the only officer, and this was past the scope of this data set, it was in 2021 that an officer was terminated. And that was after they'd been charged with murder for murdering an unarmed Black man. So that's that's what we see in the data here. No officers are being disciplined. No officers are being removed from the force, even the officers with the worst misconduct records. And so you see a system as a whole that tolerates misconduct, that tolerates the grossly disproportionate outcomes that I've described. And what we also see as a system, when the police chief or a community oversight structure does decide to step up in those rare cases and discipline an officer, In many cities, in the majority of those cases, the officer is reinstated, plus with back pay, because of the appeal process, again, that is structured by the police union contract. So in the contract, it says if an officer is fired or disciplined, they can appeal through a process called arbitration. That means they play a role in picking a lawyer who reviews the case. If the lawyer can find another case in that same city where an officer committed a similar act of misconduct and got a lesser punishment or wasn't disciplined at all, then they can just reinstate the officer, and because that is the past practice or the past standard of how you resolve those incidents. And as you can see in Columbus, and that's not unique to Columbus, in almost every case, officers aren't disciplined at all, regardless of how egregious the case. So what we see is this process results in officers who do get disciplined having those disciplinary consequences completely erased over time, because they can appeal those decisions and get reinstated. So what do we do about this? What can we learn? One, we can use the data to actually predict police violence. So I know that there's a huge conversation going on right now around AI in the context of reinforcing and exacerbating racial disparities and racial bias in criminal justice outcomes. We've seen how with risk assessments, how with predictive policing, the police and law enforcement writ large use arrest records, use information on the public to actually reinforce racially discriminatory policing strategies that then send more officers to the same communities that are already disproportionately impacted by policing, which is hugely problematic. Now, what is interesting here is that researchers, another set of researchers in the University of Chicago, have actually flipped that methodology and used it against the police. And what they've been able to do is predict police misconduct and police violence using the officer's past record of misconduct. So what they're able to do in Chicago, the Invisible Institute published an analysis where they got access to all of the records of the officers in the Chicago Police Department. We're talking about 30,000 or so officers in their database. And what they were able to do was predict, based on your proximity to one of those officers that had a huge record of misconduct, you could actually predict whether an officer that was not that officer, an officer that was just in proximity, was in the same patrol as that officer, was under the supervision of that officer, was being trained by that officer. We could predict that those officers in those circumstances down the road would be 5 times more likely to shoot somebody, 9 times more likely to be named in a misconduct complaint, and 4 times more likely to use force. So essentially what that means is that methodologically we can contact trace police violence like coronavirus. Based on your proximity to an officer that has one of these misconduct records, you are substantially more likely to be, quote unquote, infected with a culture of violence, and then use that practice or that training in the field, causing harm. So the data, the science is already here. The problem is that it is not being operationalized. The officers who are flagged by these analyses don't get removed from the force. They don't get fired. They don't get held accountable. And when they are reinstated. Which means we need to start thinking about police union contracts as a central piece of the solution, because police union contracts are most often the structural barrier for implementing so many of the things that need to happen in the context of policing. So if we want to hold officers accountable, we have to change the police union contracts that keep reinstating officers on the force. If we want to change the sort of size and scope and funding allocated to police departments, the police union contract is actually where that funding ends up being allocated, because it determines officer pay, officer benefits, et cetera. That actually is what drives the majority of these increases in police budgets year over year. So what we've learned is that so many of the things that matter in terms of changing the systems and structures that determine policing in this country run straight through this police union contract negotiation process. And the research has caught up to this as well. So now we are learning through researchers like John Rappaport and Rob Gillizo and Abdul Rad that the places that have the worst police union contracts also have higher rates of police violence, have larger racial disparities in police conduct, and more misconduct complaints. So what do we do about this? Well, first of all, change is possible. And I think the first thing to note about this is, while the data is bleak, it feels bleak, it is heavy, change is possible, and change is already happening in some places. And that's measurable change that we're tracking year over year. So for example, when we look at on the policy level, we look at issues like police union contracts. Organizers with the Austin Justice Coalition in 2016 successfully defeated the police union contract. This is one of the first cases in which a city voted, and they voted unanimously to reject a police union contract. That decision redistributed millions of dollars from the police department back into the city's general fund. It also removed some of the most problematic clauses in that contract. In Maryland, worked with local organizers and legislators to repeal a statewide police Bill of Rights law. Police Bill of Rights laws are basically, they take these provisions of police union contracts that are problematic and enshrine them in state law, so that every single city has to abide by these problematic provisions that purge the records, let officers get reinstated, et cetera. California is one of 20 states that has a police Bill of Rights law, and Maryland just became the first state to repeal one. So if it can happen there, it can certainly happen in California. Change in terms of the outcomes is happening as well. When we look at low-level arrests, so again, police departments nationwide, we do have some data on arrests. We have data on a host of things. One of the things that we know is that the vast majority of what the police do in a typical shift and at the department-wide, the agency level, it does not involve responding to issues of violence or violent crime. That about 4% of the amount of time that a police officer typically spends on a shift involves responding to violent crime, 4%. And 5% of all arrests that are made are for violent crime. When we scale that up to police violence outcomes like police shootings and deadly force, it is only about 1 in 3 cases that is in response to a violent crime. So the majority, whether you look at the most extreme cases to the most mundane cases, the majority of what the police are doing, it does not involve responding to violent crime. It does involve responding to a host of low-level issues. And what we see in Philadelphia is the police commissioner and the mayor sort of just decided in the context of the pandemic last year and the lockdown that it didn't make sense for the police to be arresting a whole bunch of people for these low-level issues, and that could potentially spread coronavirus, and that the courts were getting jammed up because they didn't have people to work the courts to process all of these cases. So they just made the decision to stop arresting people for low-level offenses. And this is their data. Literally over the course of 2 weeks, they cut arrests by about 90% and dropped low-level arrests almost to 0. So this change can happen. Not only can it happen relatively quickly when just a few decision makers decide to flip the switch and implement some of these types of approaches. Similarly, around deadly force, change can happen in places like Oakland. So we see in Oakland a reduction of about 90% in police shootings, both fatal and non-fatal, over the past decade or so, 90%. So again, if you talk to city council members or mayors, politicians, they'll tell you it's impossible to see things like this, that this is a huge issue, it'll be 400 years before we deal with this problem, et cetera. But we can see pretty dramatic shifts on key outcomes and indicators in cities across the country, and the data allows us to identify those cities and then begin to unpack what were the factors that actually explained how this happened. In Oakland, they adopted one of the strongest community oversight structures in the entire country, a structure that can actually discipline officers. They dramatically reduced arrests for low-level offenses, particularly for drug offenses. The federal government intervened. They investigated and put the department under federal court monitoring during most or all of this period. There were a host of changes that took place that organizers fought and won that actually made a huge difference here. And that's part of the story as well. So as we think about, as you go out into the world and you think about how to collect and use data as a tool to make change, there are a set of lessons that we can learn from this. One is don't wait for permission. So in 2014 and 2015, in the beginning of this conversation, at the sort of the national level, a lot of sort of big organizations and legislators spent a lot of time lobbying the federal government, lobbying the Obama administration at the time, then lobbying the Trump administration, and now they're lobbying the Biden administration to collect better data on people who are being killed by the police. The federal government still, to this day, does not have such a database. According to their most recent figures, they now have data from 43% of the nation's law enforcement agencies, and they've decided not to release any of that data publicly until they have data from 80% of the nation's law enforcement agencies, which probably will never happen given participation rates from their other programs. So essentially, they're never going to do it. And if we had waited for permission, if we'd waited to lobby the government to do it, we literally would have none of this data. And so don't wait for permission. Don't wait for a federal grant to start doing the work that you believe needs to happen in the world. Don't wait for an academic advisor to have to sign off on it or green light it. This is change that you can actually make. This is research that you can conduct right now. You have all the tools available to you at your disposal to get started. I haven't been around for 40 years doing this type of research, but I did recognize that there was an issue. There was a huge gap in the data. I had been working with data for a long time before that in the context of educational inequity, and knew that there was a lot of data that was just available online that the government was not tracking, that was not being compiled or analyzed, and that analysis could add value to a national conversation. And there are a whole lot of issues right now that could use that type of insight, that could use data collection, analysis, visualization, and you all have the tools available to you to get started on the issues that you care about that impact your life right now. And then finally, I think one of the key messages here that I just want to hit home is that that don't give up, right? That this is actually something where we do see progress being made in some places. And if we can just better understand not only where those places are, but how they produce those changes, and tell those stories and unpack those stories, not only quantitatively, but qualitatively as well, from the lived experiences of community members who not only lived it, but made those changes happen. That's how we can unpack the ingredients that we can then scale across the country to make these types of changes possible to save lives at a nationwide level. So these are some resources. If you want to learn more, I will pause there. Happy to answer any questions. And I know we want to have a discussion, so I'm excited for that.
All right. Thank you so much, Samuel. This was awesome. And we already have questions that have come in. So I think we could jump in for this conversation. This was really informative and connects to a lot of the work that we already are doing on our campuses. I'm going to start with the first question is from Brendan. And Brendan was just wanted to get your thoughts on theories, on explanations for why Portland had a 200% increase in rate of police shooting from 2013 to 2019. I'll start with that one because it's a couple follow-up questions with that one.
Yeah, so it's difficult to say that it's this one factor that created an increase. I think in Portland in particular, one of the things that we have seen in the data in Portland is that overall, when you unpack some of their data, they publish these data dashboards online as well that are pretty detailed. Portland in particular has a use of force data collection program that collects data by not only by race and gender, but also collects data on whether the people that they arrest and use force against were homeless at the time. And one of the things that you see in their data is the majority of people, and so it's a slight majority, so about 52% of the people that they arrest and use force against are homeless people. And so it's a huge, huge issue in Portland, one that local organizers have been pushing for redistributing the police budget into the budget for supporting homeless communities, for housing, and for supportive services around mental health. But that has been an ongoing fight. And again, the police union has largely opposed efforts to create different approaches to homelessness in the city. So this past year, after the police murdered George Floyd, the local organizers pushed for a huge expansion of the street response teams that are teams of unarmed mental health providers that respond to mental health calls and then calls involving people who are homeless. And they wanted to expand this to dramatically. The police union, in the context of the negotiation, basically said, you can't go beyond 5 street response teams in the city regardless, or we will not approve or agree to any police union contract. So there's an ongoing fight there to actually create alternative approaches to homelessness, because we see that that is responsible for a huge proportion of the use of force, for deadly force, for arrests overall. And it's a worsening dynamic sort of year over year as the city continues to refuse to make those investments.
All right, thank you. So how quickly do you think a city can increase or lower its rate dramatically?
Yeah, so I think what was interesting about the Philadelphia data around arrests was just how quickly they just turned off arrests. Like this was a 2-week period, and they just decided they weren't going to arrest people for a whole host of offenses that make up the vast majority of arrests that they were making. And I should note that was a sort of a short-term decision. They reversed that decision sort of partially. They said that they would go back to normal. But when you look at the arrest trends over time, even to this day, it's been steadily going down. So they actually, like, the new normal is very different than where it was just in 2019 or 2018. So I think the change can happen a lot quicker certainly than politicians and the police want you to think. And often what we found in the advocacy component of this work is that they want you to believe that this is going to take, many generations to solve, right? Like that is the narrative, that like it's been 400 years, it's going to be another 400 years, and we just need to pass the torch down, to the next generation and hope that we can make things a little bit better. But I mean, when you look at the data at the city level, I mean, it could happen in a matter of weeks if simply you had a police commissioner or a mayor that was like, that's an executive order, it's going to happen. Like that's the policy. There can no longer be arrests for these types of offenses. You see that in district attorneys where they're elected on a platform of change. You see that, for example, in Baltimore with State's Attorney Mosby, and they have more backing to do things like that as an elected position in jurisdictions that are more progressive. Like, Baltimore is probably like 70, 80% Democrat, right? So they're a little bit more of a safe jurisdiction. When we think about like how we scale this across the country, it could be a little bit more challenging. But yeah, I mean, change can happen very quickly when you have people in those positions that actually use their power to make that change happen.
All right, thank you. And this question is around the data as well. What are your thoughts on correlation between police funding levels and rates of police shootings? Brendan had commented that it might be hard to evaluate, as I guess funding is usually steady or typically goes up.
That's exactly what I was going to say. So yes, that's exactly the problem. So actually the Census Bureau has a database called the Annual Survey of State and Local Government Finances. So every single year they collect data from thousands of cities across the country and counties. And that data includes how much money they spent on policing, how much money they spent on jails and corrections, how much money they spent on housing and employment and education and a host of things. And so, in getting access to that data set, initially this was the analysis that I was looking forward to conducting, was trying to see what is the relationship between police funding and, police violence outcomes. And that was the roadblock. The fact of the matter is there were only a handful of cities of any sort of that were mid-size or large cities that were large enough where we had a large enough sample of police killings that would be able even to evaluate because they cut their police budget. Like it was literally like 3 or 4 cities that had even made any cut to their police budget, most of which were single-digit cuts. The only city that made a substantial cut was Detroit, which was largely due to bankruptcy in the city. So they didn't just cut the police budget; they cut like spending overall. So that was the challenge to evaluating that question. I do think now we're in a little bit better position to evaluate that because we have seen cities over the past year make some cuts, although even there it's sort of mixed. So about half the cities increased the budget anyway, half the cities made smaller cuts, single-digit cuts, and there were maybe 3 or 4 cities that made double-digit cuts. At like Austin, New York, and Seattle. And then some of those cuts have since been reversed due to overtime. So like the police just basically fudged the numbers. They reported that they were only going to spend this much on overtime. They knew that if they worked so many hours, the city was required to pay out overtime. So they just worked those hours anyway. The city has to pay it out and have to revise their budget projections down the road, like under the radar when organizers like have less opportunity to pressure them out of it. So that's sort of what we've seen in a lot of cities as well. But this is an open question. I think this ought to be studied. One of the things that we do see is the effectiveness of the alternatives that are being created, not only on like a reducing police violence perspective, but also on a financial perspective. When we look at programs like the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon, which is like the granddaddy program that's been around that everybody cites all the time, that is like the program sending mental health providers and not the police to mental health calls. They've published evaluations that show that they've responded to about 17% of calls for service of all of the 911 calls in the city. And they did that at a budget of about $2.1 million a year compared to the police budget of $66 million. So, when you do the math, if they're responding to 17% of the workload or 17% of the calls, and they are only really spending maybe 1/30th or so of the amount, it's actually the cost benefit is clear for those programs as well.
All right, thank you. So this is a question from Gio. Gio just had a meeting with UCI's Police Advisory Board with UCPD Chief Yao present, and after delivering data from 135 students, this clearly stated that there was a policing problem in our community. The action steps I recommended were categorized as radical change and required negotiations like any political structure in an institution. How else can I approach this issue if we don't have support from those who are supposed to offer it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question. So this idea of like radical change versus like negotiated change, I mean, one of the things that has been helpful around like the advocacy piece of this work is just being able to use the data to move the conversation beyond theory and rhetoric and politics. Because like ultimately like theoretical conversations are interesting, but like the reality is that like we ought to be rigorously evaluating whatever we're doing. We ought to be implementing solutions that are effective, that we can hold institutions accountable to measurable results. And that like when we can talk about the numbers, what I found is that we can move the conversation to that solutions conversation more easily. So I'll give you an example. One of the conversations that I had that like sticks with me, in part because I'm from Orlando, is a conversation with the Orlando police chief. And so I mentioned that Orlando has one of the highest rates of police violence in the country. Most people don't think about Orlando in that way. But in the conversation with him, he would say, so presented all the data, showed him the charts, showed him like the reason why the police were in the encounters, how, policy information around what you could do better. And he just like, before we could even, like his eyes glazed over, he was like, we're not trying to hear policy. He was just like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I don't think that we really have a problem. I think you're mischaracterizing the work of our officers. Our officers are not using force at higher rates than other officers. We're simply dealing with a more challenging environment than police anywhere else in the country. And he goes, because Orlando is such a tourist hotspot, because we get so many tourists at Disney World and Universal Studios, we have all of these tourists who are really rowdy and they get drunk in our Orange Avenue corridor downtown. And because that is a unique situation, it's uniquely challenging for our officers, they're using a lot of force to deal with those types of situations. And so you can't compare us to these other cities because we're essentially our own thing. And our officers are doing nothing wrong. They're simply responding to more challenging environments. So we don't even need to talk solutions because it's not a problem. That was like the conversation. So we tried to shut it down, and this would shut it down. And like, if he was talking to a journalist, they literally before that, they would repeat this narrative in the articles. So it would say, Orlando looks really bad in this database. Police chief though says, it's just the tourists, who knows? And like, that was the narrative. So literally brought the data into that conversation right then and showed him Orlando, showed him New Orleans, showed him Las Vegas, and said, do you mean to tell me that, or you can see in the data that Orlando, Florida uses deadly force at a rate multiple times the rate of officers in places like New Orleans, in places like Las Vegas. Do you mean to tell me that your officers are dealing with more challenging tourists than the officers in Bourbon Street or at the Las Vegas Strip? And then he said, no, like you could see like he was thinking about it and he was just not prepared to engage because he knew that that just sounded crazy. And I think like part of it is recognizing what's the narrative that they're going to come into the conversation with and being ready with the data to completely sort of disarm that narrative and move them into a solutions conversation. Because once you could move past that, he had to admit that there was a problem. And then we could start talking about what the solution should be. Now, again, on this categorization of like radical and like reformist, et cetera, I think that like when we look at the data, it supports all of the above. It supports an approach to hold the police department accountable and to address issues in police union contracts and standards within policing and removing the worst officers from the force immediately as like a harm reduction strategy, recognizing that the police are probably going to be around next year, even like under like a best case scenario. And it is piloting and scaling up the alternatives that should ultimately replace that system that can and should do a better job, but that we also need to evaluate rigorously and give the resources and the infrastructure to do that job effectively. So I think we could do all of those things together, and we should. What we should not do is funnel more resources into the system of policing that has not an evidence-based practice and certainly has not served our communities well.
Thank you. And I want to put a correction out there. It was the UCSB Police Advisory Board. So I just want to put that out there. Thank you. One of the things, there were requests for the resources. We put the resources in the chat, so you should have that. But there's another question about resources and this is more so about working with people outside of the institution. So what kinds of people, lawyers, activists, et cetera, should we look for that provide enough credibility, but also a compelling argument for this issue, especially when sometimes when students and faculty and staff are already presenting this argument?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, one of the things that has been really helpful in doing this work outside of the context of an institution, and again, just evaluating what type of work you want to do, because it could either be enabled by doing it in the context of an institution or not. There are things that we can do that we'd never be able to do in the context of an institution. So getting the data on officer names and like showing the officer names, like, I don't know if y'all know IRB rules, but like you're not supposed to disclose the names of subjects. So there are a lot of researchers that get a lot of data, like privileged data that we could never get access to, which is a benefit, but they can't disclose the names of the officers, their misconduct records, information, like even to the families of people who are harmed by those officers. And that puts you in a difficult sort of institutional position as well. So I think that there are a lot of limitations to doing things in the context of an institution. There are strengths, so you can get more resources, more legitimacy. You already have a platform to release things, but there are trade-offs in terms of what you can release, what you can say. If you are, who is providing that funding, and maybe there are institutional limitations on the willingness of the institution to go after the police department. So those things we've seen. I mean, we've seen researchers who make a lot of money in grants from the same agencies that they are then writing reports about, right? So if you're funded by the city to write a report on the police department and your report doesn't say good things about the city, you might feel pressure not to release that report. And we've seen researchers like redact findings in some institutions, and that's troubling, right? So I think, so evaluate those things on the front end. I think in terms of doing this outside of the institution, one of the critical aspects is, number one, being radically transparent in the work. So all of the data that we have is public. All the data is downloadable at mappingpoliceviolence.org. All of the charts are interactive, where you can actually like zoom in and see like the source data. That's an intentional strategy, because it can't be that you just have to believe me, like who am I, right? Like this is the data, these are the sources. If you dispute the data, like here it is, like react to the actual facts in the data. So I think that's one of the strategies. The second strategy is creating a way of getting around not having a platform. So if you're not at an institution, if you don't have like a formal platform to put things out in the world, there are other channels. So for me, Twitter has been a really important resource for doing that. Recognize that there are a lot of journalists, there are a lot of academics, there are a lot of policymakers on Twitter. Twitter allows me to speak to them directly without having to go through like an intermediary. So I'm putting facts out there, statistics out there, links to the sources out there that then gets picked up immediately in articles, or policymakers will reach out directly to want to learn more. So that sort of alleviates some of the challenges around legitimacy in that way. So I think there are different ways of going about it. Certainly, if you're interested in linking up with organizers, researchers that are already doing this work, I'm going to be happy to connect with you if you want to reach out to me. But certainly there are many ways to do the work, each with its own trade-offs.
All right, thank you. And since we're talking about strategies and resources, I'll give another question related to that, and then we'll transition a little bit to some questions about the data. How does one obtain and view local city police department union contracts?
Yes. So actually, this is in the chat. One of the resources, nixthe6.org. So we found the police union contracts for about 600 of the largest cities in the country already, and are continuing to find more. So in terms of finding the contracts, there are a couple ways to do it. Sometimes the city will post the contract online. So first of all, look at that site. Your city's probably in there, 600 of the largest cities in the country. If your city's not in there, the way to find it is on your city's website. Usually there's like a labor relations page, or even universities usually have police union contracts with the school police department. So usually it's like the labor relations page of the site. Usually that's where all the union contracts are. Sometimes the union might have it on their website. So if you look at the local police union's website, if they're not posted online anywhere, you would need to submit a public records request. One website that's been really helpful for us is muckrock.com, muckrock.com, which makes it really easy. You just put in the name of your city, you put like what you want, police union contract, like the most recent police union contract, and then you just click send, and they send off the public records request and manage like the back and forth. But that's how you get it if it's not yet on the site. One of the things we've done on the site is actually reviewed each of those 600 contracts, flagged each of the provisions that we found that impact the accountability process, and included some details there around if you want to contact your legislators to tell them to change it. So all of that information is there for those cities. And again, if you want to learn more, happy to work with you directly.
All right. And that question came from Sakil. If I messed that up, I'm so sorry, but I definitely wanted to acknowledge you. And so now this is around the data communication. This is a comment from Joanna, that we have all these data, huge figures and graphs, but studies have shown that dumping data on people doesn't always help to convince them. And so I'll add a question to that. What else, how can we use this data to convince individuals, and what else can we do?
Great question. So that's correct, right? Like that is 100% correct. I think everybody has different learning styles. So for me, like I respond to like the numbers and like the research. I'm always looking for like, what does the research paper say? What's the methodological design? Like, does this make sense? That's probably not the most common way that people process information. So most people, I suspect, are responsive to feeling a personal connection with the issue, or with a person who was impacted by that issue, or being impacted directly themselves, right? And so I think, and we see that. So I think the data is a part of this broader conversation that's been going on for quite some time. And I would say most of that conversation has really been has not been focused on the data, right? Most of that conversation has been seeing cases of police violence, right? Seeing the videos, seeing people who were harmed or murdered by the police, seeing family members grieving, seeing communities take to the streets in defense of people who had been harmed by the police. So I think that actually has been like the primary message that has been communicated sort of writ large. And I think that is correct, right? I think that has been why we have seen so many people who that message has resonated with, who have taken to the streets, who have conducted advocacy, many for the first time around these issues. I also know that, we're talking about anti-Blackness. We got to talk about white supremacy and how it operates. And this is, a lot of institutions are guilty of this. Academia is guilty of this, right? Policymaking circles are guilty of this. There is a widespread approach that often dismisses individual anecdotes and stories and lived experiences, testimonials from individuals, particularly in marginalized communities, in lieu of numbers, in lieu of charts, in lieu of research, in lieu of data. And in absence of data in 2014 and 15, we were seeing, and in large part I got involved in this work in reaction to seeing people in the media, seeing people in policymaking circles say, well, we see this case and we see that case in this city and we see this family member, but we don't know if these are isolated incidents and tragic cases, but they don't reflect policing in general. They don't reflect a systemic issue, or we don't know whether they do or not because we haven't seen the data, we haven't seen the research, we haven't seen the numbers. And they would use that as a way to avoid taking action. And so by providing the data, it just removed one more excuse for them not taking action, and again, put them in a solutions conversation that they should have been having all along.
All right, thank you. So with the data, there's some follow-up questions about the axes. And so this is related to the violent crime versus police killings graph. Why are the axes not normalized to get direct comparison? One is per 1,000 and one is per 100,000. And if normalization isn't important, why is that the case? And that question came from Franco. Thank you, Franco.
Question. So the purpose of the chart is for you to be able to look at the connection between cities that have a relatively higher or lower rate of violent crime and cities that have a relatively higher or lower rate of killings by police. So the axes are designed the way that they are so that you can make those comparisons very quickly. So that's why they're designed. That's why they're at the rates that they are.
Perfect. Thank you. This question is around the quality and completeness of the data. Are you, and this is from Toshio, are you worried that the quality, completeness of police shooting data may be better for recent years than historically? This could bias estimates of reductions.
Yes. So you see that in our database, we only go back to 2013. The reason that we don't go back earlier is not because we can't find any cases. It's because we have the same worry, which is that because so many of these cases we're only able to find by finding those local news reports online, and the internet hasn't been as popular as it is now in the past, that as we go back further in time, many of the articles themselves no longer exist. So like you click on the link and the article is no longer up. Some of the publications that were out at that time no longer exist. And in some cases, it may be that the article would never have been written in the first place, or if it was written, would not have been published online as we go back earlier in time. So that does make it extremely difficult to go back before 2013. So that's one of the limitations of our knowledge of police violence in general. So when you look at the federal data, which we know is incomplete, that data suggests that historically we've seen a reduction. That back in the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, there were more instances where police were killing people than there are today. But we don't know for sure because it could be a function of reporting rates. It could be a function of other changes to how police departments are tracking the data or how the federal government's tracking the data. And because their database is so incomplete, we just don't have the full picture before 2013, which is a huge problem.
Thank you. This next question is from Seth. Seth is curious about the data on police killings. You alluded to the possibility of undercounting. Can you talk more about why undercounting is an issue? Also, can you talk more generally about the quality of the data, threats to validity, and ways it has or is or can be improved?
Great questions. So in terms of how comprehensive is the data, we have a couple of ways of evaluating that. There have been a couple of investigations, one through the Bureau of Justice Statistics of the federal government, which has since everybody called them out on not having comprehensive data. They conducted a follow-up analysis where they basically opened up their methodology for how they're going to collect this data. For a single year period, they tracked cases using local media reports, using public records requests, using coroner's reports, using a whole expanded methodology for collecting the data. And they collected data for that 1 year. It was like half of 2015 and half of 2016 was the time period. And this is in the About section of the Mapping Police Violence site. So we compared their numbers through that collection with our numbers. And I believe it was 90 or 95% of the total of that total we already had in our database. I believe 95. So that was one way of evaluating. The second was a multiple systems analysis that was conducted by the Human Rights Data Analysis Group. So they used a methodology where they looked at the level of overlap between the existing databases. And they actually were able to evaluate, using this methodology, the total number of cases, like the total universe of cases, including cases that would not be captured by either database. So by looking at the proximity in reporting between the two databases that existed, they could estimate the cases that were not being reported by either database. What they estimated was that there were about 1,200 people killed by police each year. Again, our database has about 1,100 people killed by police each year. So those are the two estimations that have happened to date. Those are like the most rigorous analyses or estimations around the total universe of people killed by police. And so where are the gaps, right? So we have about 95% of the total number of people killed by police in our database. We also know that there are gaps that are disproportionately in areas where it would be less likely to be reported in the media if you were killed by the police. So if you are killed by the police, it's not reported in the media and posted online, you're much less likely to be tracked in any of the databases that exist. And we know that that's disproportionately in rural areas, it is in indigenous communities. So that is where we're seeing a lot of gaps in the data. So that's where the database could be improved substantially. I think the other piece of this is, we're talking about fatal force. As I mentioned, police violence extends way beyond cases that result in death. And for those cases, it is far less likely to be reported in the media. So if you are tased, if you are punched in the face, if you are sexually assaulted by the police, it is almost never reported in the media. And so data collection around those issues tends to depend on whether the police department is even tracking it in the first place and not purging the records. And then if they provide those records upon request, or if there's a state database that requires those records to be collected. And there are very few states that have that. So those are also areas where it could be improved substantially. Yeah, I think those are some of the key ones. The last piece is around categorization. So there's not like a uniform definition around these issues. So even the definition killed by police, there's not like a uniform standard. So there are a number of cases, for example, where people are tased by police and they try to say that the person had what they call excited delirium. They tried to do this with George Floyd, where they try to say that the person, and they try to do this with Eric Garner as well, where they try to say the person, had pre-existing conditions, health issues, they might have been having an illness, so they really died of that. And the police just sort of played a small role in their death. And so when you read that, you know that the police, you look at the initial report that the police put out on George Floyd, it says nothing about like the chokehold. It says nothing about choking him for 8 or 9 minutes. It says nothing about what the police actually did. Oftentimes it's the only type of information that's reported about a case. So we know the data is skewed in that way, where we only have the information that is either reported by the police, reported by the media, often based on the police report, or somehow made available through video evidence, most of which is collected by the police. Every once in a while we get bystander video. So I think that our interpretation is probably a more conservative account of what the reality is, given that. But even then, I think there are a host of things that are very difficult to track, are very difficult to report, and when they are reported, are just skewed in a way that's very hard to even categorize, given the information that we're given. So I think all of those are areas that we can improve on.
All right, thank you. So we don't have any more questions. So I'm going to talk a little longer just in case a question wants to pop up. But I did want to let our audience know that we do have an evaluation for this event. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. We would like your input so that we can continue to offer these initiatives next year and continue to improve on them. So if you have a few minutes, please complete the evaluation. There was a couple of questions about our speakers' contact information, and thank you so much, Sam, for putting it in the chat. It is in the chat if you need Sam's email address. No other questions have popped up, so I just want to say thank you. Thank you on behalf of UC Santa Barbara as well as UC Irvine. This has been a phenomenal talk. Some messages are coming in. Audra said, this has been an incredible talk. Thank you so much for doing this work and taking the time to share with us. And Carrie, thank you. Thank you. This is informative and an important presentation. And I just want to echo the same thing. I've learned quite a bit today. And I appreciate, I'm an engineer by training, so I love data. And I truly believe that, data, we need to position ourselves to use data to be more radical and to use it to move the needle to find solutions. So thank you so much, Sam, for joining us. Thank you to our UCSB and UCI community for coming to this talk, as well as the talks that we had this year. We look forward to bringing this back next year. And so thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.